17-year-old Omega Kian Ashford waits at the village boundary stone where his older brother Dorian told him to wait 3 years ago before marching off to war. The war ended 6 months ago. Kian has been waiting in the snow for 5 days straight, surviving on nothing but determination and the single silver coin he refuses to spend on food. He's saving it to hire someone to find Dorian. When the conquering Alpha King Theron Valdis rides through with his army, accompanied by massive warhounds and an aura of death, the villagers scatter. But Kian, half-frozen, desperate, and too exhausted to be afraid, walks right up to the king's warhorse and asks, "Excuse me, your majesty. Have you seen my brother? I can pay." The crowd expects the Omega to be executed for such disrespect. Instead, the terrifying Alpha King dismounts and kneels. Chapter 1. The cold had stopped hurting about an hour ago. Kian thought that was probably bad, but he couldn't quite remember why. Something Papa used to say about frostbite back when Papa was still alive to say things. The memory felt fuzzy now, like trying to grab smoke. He shifted his weight carefully on the boundary stone. His boots had split along the sides 2 days ago, maybe 3. Snow soaked through the gaps, turning his socks into frozen lumps against his feet. The cold didn't matter though. Nothing mattered except staying right here. Wait at the boundary stone, Dorian had said 3 years ago, kneeling so their eyes were level. One amber, one gray. Just like Kian's. When the war ends, you wait right here. I'll always find you there, little star. Kian touched the stone marker with one numb hand. The war was over now. Everyone said so. The Alpha King had crushed the rebellion, united the territories, ended the decade of fighting. Which meant Dorian was coming home down this very road, and he'd see Kian waiting just like he'd promised, and he'd scoop him up and spin him around like he used to when Kian was small. He just had to wait a little longer. His stomach cramped. Sure. Kian pressed a hand against it and breathed through his nose. The innkeeper had thrown him out 6 days ago. Your brother's dead, boy. No coin means no room. Out. But the innkeeper was wrong. Dorian wasn't dead. He'd promised to come back. Dorian never broke promises. Kian curled his fingers around the single silver coin in his pocket. He wasn't going to spend it on food. He was going to use it to hire someone to find Dorian. Dorian always said fair work deserved fair payment. Kian had asked 47 people in 6 days. Someone would know something eventually. That was just mathematics. A horn sounded in the distance. Kian's head snapped up. But the villagers around him weren't gathering to greet returning soldiers. They were scattering. Pressing themselves against buildings, yanking children into doorways, eyes going wide with something that looked like terror. "Don't look up," a man hissed to his daughter, dragging her backward. "You want to lose your tongue?" Then the warhounds came. Massive shapes, darker than shadows, eyes gleaming gold in the gray light. They paced alongside horses, moving like violence-given fur and teeth. The villagers flattened themselves against walls, heads down, shoulders hunched. Kian didn't understand the fear pulsing through the crowd, but he understood one thing. This was the army. And if this was the army coming home from war, someone here might know where Dorian was. He stood up. His legs shook, but they held. The procession was led by a single rider on a warhorse so black it looked like it had been cut from midnight. The man wore dark furs across his shoulders, armor that looked like it had seen 100 battles and won all of them. Scars crossed his face. One through his eyebrow, another along his jaw, a third disappearing into his collar. The crowd stopped breathing. Kian started forward. "How dare you?" A guard's voice cracked like a whip. "Kneel?" Kian barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the man on the warhorse, the one everyone was staring at with that specific kind of fear that meant important. "You're in the presence of His Majesty, Alpha King Theron Valdis of the Northern Territories." Kian's heart leaped. The Alpha King. If anyone could help find Dorian, it was him. He walked right up to the massive warhorse, tilted his face up until he found the king's eyes. Green. Deep dark green like forests in shadow. "Excuse me, Mr. King?" Kian asked. The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning struck. The king's gaze fell on him. Heavy. Intense. The kind of look that made Kian's Omega instincts whisper alpha, dangerous, run. But Kian was too tired and too cold and too desperate to run. "Have you seen my brother?" Kian asked and smiled because Mama always said smiling helped people want to help you. The soldiers went rigid. One reached for his sword. The warhounds growled, low and threatening. "Your Majesty, shall I dispose of?" The king lifted one hand. The guard stopped mid-breath. The hounds went silent. Kian, encouraged, continued. "My brother is a soldier. He has eyes like mine." He pointed to his own face, to the mismatched eyes he'd inherited. One amber, one gray. "His name is Dorian Ashford. Do you know him?" The king's face did something strange. His jaw clenched. A muscle ticked in his cheek. Then he dismounted in one fluid movement that made Kian take an involuntary step back. The crowd pulled away like water from oil. But Kian held his ground even when the king came closer, even when Kian had to tilt his head all the way back to keep looking at his face. The king knelt. Someone in the crowd made a choking sound. The guard's hand fell away from his sword, his face going slack with shock. "Have you been alone long, child?" the king asked. His voice was rough. "Damaged somehow." 6 days, Kian said. "My brother told me to wait here when the war ended." He looked at the king's scarred face, at the way everyone had stopped moving entirely. "Thank you for ending the war, Mr. King." Before he could think better of it, before his brain caught up with his frozen limbs, Kian launched himself forward and wrapped his arms around the king's neck. The king went completely still. The entire crowd went completely still. Silence fell like fresh snow, thick and absolute. "It's cold, child," the king said after a long moment. "Go back inside." "I can't." Kian pulled back just enough to look at him. "My brother's coming home soon. I have to wait here so he can find me." Something in the king's expression made Kian's stomach twist. Not anger. Something worse. Something sad. "Mr. Your Majesty," Kian tried, fumbling for the right words. "Can you please help me find my brother?" Sharp gasps rippled through the crowd. Kian wasn't foolish though. He was prepared. He dug the silver coin from his pocket and held it up proudly between them. "I can pay," he said. "My brother says good work shouldn't come for free. I can pay honest money." The crowd's collective inhale sounded like wind before a storm. A heartbeat passed. Then another. "All right," the king said quietly. He studied Kian's trembling hands, the split boots, the hollow spaces under his eyes. "Come with me, little one. You'll eat. You'll be warm." Kian's heart swelled. But then he shook his head. "If I leave, my brother won't find me." The king looked away. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "If your brother returns?" "When he returns," Kian corrected firmly. The king grimaced. "When he returns," he said like the word cost him something. "I will leave word. He will know where to find you." Kian studied his face, remembering what Dorian always said. Kind eyes mean good hearts. The king's eyes were tired. Heavy, like he was carrying something too big to set down. But not cruel. "You promise?" Kian asked, his voice small. "I am the king," the man said. "My word is law." "Then I'll come," Kian said. Behind him, the village released a collective breath of pure shock. Chapter 2. Duke Cassian Nightshade had perfected the art of standing like a statue. Spine straight, chin lifted, hands clasped behind his back. No one watching would guess that beneath his carefully maintained mask, he was imagining this entire fortress crumbling to dust with the Alpha King buried beneath it. Snow gathered on the black stone courtyard. It was crowded with nobles and soldiers, all assembled to witness the king's return. To witness Cassian's humiliation, more like. The official engagement ceremony was scheduled for tomorrow. Cassian would stand beside the man who destroyed his kingdom and smile while they announced the wedding date. Drums sounded in the distance. Rhythmic thunder that made his teeth clench. He was coming. The man who'd crushed the southern province in 3 brutal years. The man Cassian was being forced to marry. A noblewoman shifted beside him, leaning close. "They say he killed 12 alphas in single combat during the siege of Greymont." Cassian didn't turn his head. "Yes, well, efficiency is often the hallmark of tyranny." The woman went quiet. Cassian caught her nervous glance and felt a flicker of satisfaction. He was the Duke of the Southern Province, son of a proud bloodline that stretched back centuries. No amount of force could make him forget what had been taken from him. Even if he had to stand here and pretend otherwise. The engagement had been arranged 4 months ago, after the war that left his kingdom in ruins. The terms were simple. Duke Cassian would marry Alpha King Theren, ensuring peace and his family's survival. He would become the king's consort, the symbol of the South's submission to the North. He'd met Theren only once, during the official engagement announcement. The memory still made his stomach turn. The king had stood at the far end of the throne room, and even across that vast space, his presence had been overwhelming. Cassian had tried not to pay attention, had focused on the advisor's negotiating terms. But then Theren had looked at him. One long assessing look from eyes the color of deep forest. Green but darker than any green had a right to be. Predator's eyes. Cassian had stared back with all the defiance he could pack into a single glance. It had infuriated him, that look. The casual way Theren had assessed him like he was a horse being considered for purchase. But what infuriated him more was the small, traitorous part of himself that noticed the king was beautiful in the way a blade could be beautiful. Deadly and perfect and utterly capable of destruction. He'd crushed that thought immediately. Refused to let it surface ever again. Trumpets sounded sharp and clear. The gates began to open. Cassian's fingers tightened behind his back. He'd survived this long by hiding his hatred behind perfect manners. He could survive this too. A massive black wolf padded into the courtyard. The crowd fell silent. This was the Alpha King's wolf form. The embodiment of every nightmare that had haunted the southern province for 3 years. Its shoulders came up to a man's chest, muscles rippling beneath fur so black it seemed to absorb light. And it had a child on its back. Cassian blinked, certain he'd imagined it. But no. There was definitely a small figure perched there, wrapped in a cloak far too large, face pinched with cold and something that looked like hunger. What in the frozen hell? A guard stepped forward with a heavy fur. The child climbed down carefully, and the wolf moved away, padding behind a carved screen that had been hastily positioned near the gates. Clearly a regular accommodation for the king's transformations. Moments later the man emerged. Alpha King Theron Valdis. Cassian's breath caught despite himself. The king was taller than he'd remembered. Broader. Dark hair fell loose around his shoulders now, damp with melted snow, softening nothing. Those eyes, dark green and intense, swept the assembled crowd. Cassian hated that he noticed. Theren walked back to where the child waited and, with a gentleness that made absolutely no sense, lifted the small figure into his arms. The contrast was startling. Those large, scarred hands that had wielded sword and claw with devastating effect, now cradling a child with obvious care. And the child just settled against his broad chest like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Your castle is very pretty," the child said, voice bright and trusting. Cassian stared at the dark fortress built into the heart of the mountains. Pretty was not the word he'd use. Oppressive maybe. Threatening. A monument to conquest. But the king said nothing, just carried the child forward, and Cassian found himself wondering, who was this? An illegitimate child? A secret son from before the war? That would explain the protectiveness. But why bring him here? Why now? The king strode forward, the child still in his arms, and the crowd parted automatically. His eyes swept the assembled nobles, cataloging, assessing threats. Then his gaze found Cassian. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other across the courtyard. Cassian kept his face perfectly neutral, his eyes cold, his posture rigid. Something flickered in those dark green eyes. Something that made Cassian's pulse quicken in a way he absolutely refused to acknowledge. "Duke Cassian," Theren said. His voice was as rough as Cassian remembered. Cassian inclined his head with perfect glacial politeness. "Your Majesty." For just a moment, the king's expression shifted. Disappointment, maybe. But then it was gone, smoothed away behind that impenetrable mask. Theren turned away, carrying the child toward the raised platform where his throne waited, and Cassian found himself watching the way he moved. Like a predator who'd never learned to doubt his own power. Cassian looked away sharply, annoyed with himself. Meanwhile, the court murmured, confused and curious. Cassian wasn't the only one staring at the child. Up close now, Cassian could see how thin the child was. How his clothes hung off his small frame like he'd been wearing them for months without eating. A courtier leaned toward another, whispering loud enough for Cassian to hear. "Who is he?" Cassian expected the king to explain. To announce the child as his son, perhaps. Or ward. Instead, Theren simply said, "He is under my protection." The child beamed up at him, and Cassian felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. "His Majesty is very kind," the child announced to the entire court with absolute sincerity. Cassian barely held back a laugh. "God, the Alpha King? He took me in to wait for my brother," the child continued, utterly earnest. "Because now that he ended the war he's going to help everyone. All the hungry children and hurt soldiers can come here. The king takes care of people. Silence crashed across the courtyard like a physical force. Cassian went very still. Because everyone in this courtyard knew one simple fact. 4 months ago, a council member had proposed opening the fortress to war refugees. The king had refused. Everyone knew that. And now this child, this strange thin little boy, was proclaiming to the entire court that the king had promised the exact opposite. Cassian leaned forward slightly, fascinated despite himself. The king's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked in his cheek. Then he exhaled slowly, deliberately. Prepare the guest halls. His voice was controlled, careful. Any wounded soldiers or displaced children who seek refuge will be admitted. Cassian felt his own eyes widen. The Queen Mother, standing near the throne, stiffened visibly. Your Majesty, she said, her voice low and sharp. This was not. It is now, the king interrupted. Cassian stared. He'd spent months studying this man, learning his patterns, his cruelties, his unshakable adherence to strength above all else. And in less than 5 minutes, one small half-frozen child had just completely upended the king's entire policy. The court began to dismiss, nobles and soldiers filing out in small groups, their whispers creating a low buzz of speculation. Cassian remained where he was, mind racing. What had he just witnessed? And more importantly, who was that child, and why did the terrifying Alpha King look at him like he'd hung the moon? Chapter 3. Kian woke up on his 3rd morning in the palace and stared at the ceiling. It was painted. Little silver stars against deep blue, like the night sky Papa used to point at when teaching him constellations. At home, the ceiling had been plain wood with a water stain shaped like a rabbit. He missed Dorian. Not in the sad way that made his chest hurt, just the normal way. Where he wanted to tell his brother about the painted ceiling and how the fireplace kept going all night without anyone adding wood and how his room had an actual door that locked from the inside. Kian slipped out of bed, pulled on one of the simple tunics someone had left for him, and went looking for the king. He wanted to ask if there was any news yet. If anyone had seen Dorian. The hallways were huge and echo-y. Kian peeked into rooms as he passed. Most had people doing boring grown-up things, shuffling papers and talking in serious voices. He kept walking. Then he almost crashed into the most beautiful person he'd ever seen. Oh, the person said. A man, Kian realized. Wearing a coat the color of deep water, his face like something from one of Papa's fairy tales. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless but probably wasn't. I'm so sorry, Kian said quickly. I wasn't watching where. It's quite all right. The man's voice was smooth and a little surprised. Are you lost, child? A little bit, Kian admitted. I'm looking for the king. Do you know where he might be? Something flickered across the man's face. The king is likely in the council chambers or the training grounds. Why do you need to see him? I wanted to ask if there's news about my brother, Kian said, then remembered his manners. I'm Kian. What's your name? I know who you are. The man smiled slightly. I am Duke Cassian Nightshade. Kian's whole face went hot with excitement. The Duke? The one who's marrying the king? Yes, Cassian said carefully. That one. Oh. Kian clasped his hands together. You're so beautiful. You're the most beautiful person I've ever seen. I can see exactly why the king is so in love with you. The Duke's cheeks turned pink. Actually pink. Oh, I wouldn't say he's in love. Of course he is, Kian interrupted. And you must love him very much too to be marrying him. Cassian's mouth got tight. He looked away, something complicated moving across his face. But then he just said quietly, Come. I'll walk with you. They walked together, Kian taking 2 steps for every one of Cassian's. This was perfect. The king was a hero and he was marrying a beautiful, kind duke. And soon Dorian would come home and they'd probably all live here together like a family. The corridor opened into a courtyard. Cold air hit Kian's face, making him shiver. Then he heard a cracking noise and jumped. What's that? Duke Cassian's hand touched his shoulder. Kian, perhaps we should. But Kian had already seen. A boy tied to a post, older than Kian but not by much. Maybe 14. His shirt was gone and there were red marks across his back. A guard stood nearby with a whip. The whip rose. The boy jerked against the ropes but didn't scream. Stop. Kian screamed. Everyone turned to look at him. The guard, other soldiers, servants carrying laundry. all of them staring. Why are you hurting him? Kian demanded. He failed his duty, the guard replied like it was obvious. Like it made sense. Duke Cassian's hand tightened on Kian's shoulder. Kian, come. This is how things are done here. There's nothing you can. Kian shook his head. Dorian had taught him that hurting people was wrong. Always wrong. Papa had taught him that strength meant protecting people, not punishing them. He pulled away from Cassian and stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. The king wouldn't stand for this, Kian said. The guards looked at each other and laughed. Actually laughed. You don't know the king, little boy. Kian's whole chest got hot. Of course I do. And I know he helps people because he's a hero. The guard hesitated. Not because of what Kian said. Because Duke Cassian had stepped up beside him. Leave the boy alone, Cassian said, his voice cool and commanding. He's had enough. The guards lowered their whips. But then, what is this interruption? A voice sharp and cold. Kian turned. A woman stood at the courtyard entrance. Tall and elegant, wrapped in dark furs. Everyone straightened immediately, going rigid with something that looked like fear. The Queen Mother. Kian recognized her from the courtyard yesterday. She looked at Kian and her eyes were cold. Why is this child in my courtyard? Ma'am, Kian said, trying to be polite. They're hurting him. He pointed at the boy tied to the post. It's not right. The Queen Mother would help, Kian thought. She was the king's mother. Dorian always said mothers had the softest hearts. Duke Cassian spoke up. The boy has been whipped enough, Your Majesty. The Queen Mother smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. You wouldn't know what's enough, Duke. Your army lost the war after all. She looked at the guards. Continue. Kian's stomach dropped. But the king wouldn't. Child, the Queen Mother waved her hand dismissively. The king allows what must be done. The whip rose again. Kian's whole body went cold, then hot. No. The king had saved him. Promised to help hungry children and hurt soldiers. Heroes didn't let children get hurt. He ran straight at the post, arms spread wide, putting himself between the whip and the boy. No. Duke Cassian screamed. Kian heard running behind him, but he was already there, arms spread wide, heart pounding. The whip stopped. Everything went quiet. Then footsteps. Heavy ones. King Theren was here. Relief flooded through Kian's whole body, warm and bright. He'd known the king would come. Known it like he knew Dorian would come home. Theren walked into the courtyard like thunder given form. Tall and powerful, his face dark with something that made even the guards step back. Explain, he said. Just one word, but it made everyone flinch. The guard dropped to his knee. Discipline, Your Majesty. The boy failed to. But the king was looking at Kian now. Those green eyes found his and Kian smiled. He couldn't help it. Mr. King, Kian said. You came. Theren walked closer and stopped right in front of him. Kian had to tilt his head way back to see his face. You wouldn't let them hurt him, would you? Kian asked. He knew the answer like he knew the sun would rise. The king was good. He was. The Queen Mother stepped forward. Weakness breeds chaos, my son. Discipline maintains. I will be the judge of that, the king said, not looking at her. Release him. The Queen Mother's face went tight. This undermines order. Release him, Theren repeated. Now. A guard untied the ropes. The boy collapsed. Another guard caught him before he hit the ground. Kian took the king's hand and squeezed it. The king's hand was huge around his, calloused and scarred, but warm. Perhaps you should explain to the guards that whipping is simply not acceptable, Kian said earnestly. I don't think they understand because if they did, they'd never have whipped the poor boy in the first place. The king looked at all the guards, at the Queen Mother, at the boy being helped away. He breathed out slow. No one in this fortress will be whipped again, he said. His voice carried across the entire courtyard. Is that understood? Your Majesty, the Queen Mother started. Is that understood? Silence. Then murmurs of agreement from the guards. Kian's smile got so big it hurt his face. Thank you, Your Majesty. And then he hugged him. Threw his arms around the king's waist and squeezed as hard as he could, pressing his face against the king's coat. Theren went completely still. Like he'd turned into a statue. But Kian didn't let go. You're a hero, he said into the fabric. I knew you were. The king's hand came down on Kian's head. Just for a second. Just a gentle wait. Across the courtyard, Duke Cassian stood watching, and something in his carefully controlled expression had cracked wide open. Chapter 4. Duke Cassian stood outside the king's war chamber with his hands clasped behind his back, forcing his spine straight, his chin level. The perfect picture of a composed nobleman about to negotiate terms. Inside, his heart beat too fast. He'd requested this meeting 3 days ago. Had prepared his arguments, rehearsed his requests until the words felt smooth and controlled. The marriage contract had been negotiated by advisors and signed by his father. But there were details, critical details, that could mean the difference between his people keeping their sacred spaces or losing the last remnants of their identity. The door opened. A guard gestured him inside. The war chamber hit him immediately. Smoke and steel, old leather, and something sharper. Maps covered a massive table in the center, marked with territories and troop movements that had destroyed Cassian's home. Weapons lined the walls in deliberate arrangement. This was the room where wars were planned, where kingdoms fell, where his had fallen. Theren stood at the table reviewing documents, his back to Cassian. Even without armor, he was imposing. Broad shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual combat, not ceremonial training. Dark hair slightly disheveled, sleeves rolled to his elbows, forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. He looked up when Cassian entered, and those green eyes found his. Cassian's breath caught despite himself. Predatory in a way that made his beta instincts flare. Half warning, half something he refused to name. Duke Cassian, Theren said. His voice was rough, controlled. Your Majesty. Cassian kept his tone neutral even as his pulse jumped. Theren gestured to the chairs near the fireplace. They sat, and immediately Cassian was aware of how close they were. He could see the details he tried to ignore in the courtyard. The scar through his eyebrow, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his hands moved with controlled precision as he pushed the marriage contract toward Cassian. Cassian looked down at the document quickly before his thoughts could wander further. You had concerns about the terms? Theren asked. Clarifications, Cassian corrected, pleased that his voice came out steady. Article 7 addresses the treatment of Southern Province customs and sacred sites. It's vague. Be specific about what you need. Cassian took a breath. The Temple of the Lunar Winds. It must remain accessible to my people for worship, for ceremonies. It's mentioned in the territories list, but not explicitly protected. Theren watched him carefully. The temple matters to your people. It wasn't a question, but Cassian answered anyway. It's been the heart of our province for 600 years. Our customs don't interfere with yours. It's simply a place of... The temple will remain protected, Theren interrupted. I see no objection to that. Cassian stopped mid-sentence. He'd prepared arguments, counterpoints, bargaining positions. And the king was just agreeing? In exchange for what? The words came out sharper than he'd intended. Theren frowned. I'm sorry? Don't play ignorant. Heat rose in Cassian's chest. We both know you're not the type to give anything for free, Your Majesty. Silence fell between them, heavy and charged. Theren leaned back in his chair. You're really unhappy about our upcoming union, aren't you? The question felt like a hand closing around Cassian's throat. You didn't choose this, Theren said quietly. No, Cassian said. I did not. Guilt stirred in his chest, small and uncomfortable. Theren was being reasonable, almost kind in his gruff, awkward way. And here Cassian was, throwing his concessions back in his face. Though I suppose, Cassian said carefully, I'm reassured to see that innocent children will not be whipped to death anymore. Theron's eyes snapped to his. Right, he said looking away. That uncertainty again, like he didn't quite know what to do with praise. The boy was correct. It was wrong. It was good of you, Cassian added. To change it. Theren made a sound, half snort, half exhale, but said nothing. His gaze drifted to the fire, and Cassian found himself watching the way the light played across his features. Tired, conflicted, human. The child, Cassian said, his curiosity overriding caution. Kian. Theron's gaze shifted back. What of him? Who is he to you? Cassian leaned forward slightly, drawn in despite himself. Something flickered across Theron's face. Pain quickly suppressed. An orphan. He says he's waiting for his brother, Cassian pressed. His brother is dead. Flat. Final. How do you know? Theren tensed. Every line of his body went rigid. If he weren't, he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him, he would have come for Kian by now. Wouldn't you say? There was more to this. Something Theren wasn't saying. Something that caused him actual pain. Fine, Cassian said. An orphan. There are plenty of those around the kingdom. So why him? He is my responsibility, Theren said finally. Cassian's beta senses rose, the instinct to scent, to read what words wouldn't reveal. He breathed in carefully, sorting through the layers. Pine, smoke, leather, and underneath it all, that distinctly alpha musk that made something in Cassian's chest tighten uncomfortably. But beneath all of that, no trace of the child. Wolves always carried their family's scent. Always. Parents, siblings, pack. It lingered on skin and clothes and hair, a biological marker impossible to fake or hide. Kian had none of Theron's scent on him. Not even a whisper. Not his son then. Not blood. Cassian realized he'd leaned closer without meaning to, and their eyes met. Those dark green eyes, intense and burning, watching him with an expression Cassian couldn't name. Heat flooded his face. He pulled back sharply, looking at the fireplace instead. This was the man who'd destroyed his home. The fact that he smelled good meant absolutely nothing. How do I make him feel safe? Theren said quietly. Cassian blinked. What? Kian. I mean. Theren shifted in his chair, that uncertainty creeping back. You seem observant, Duke. Any advice? Of all the things Cassian had expected from this meeting, the conquering Alpha King asking him for parenting advice was not one of them. Children don't trust proclamations, Cassian said slowly, still processing. They trust presence. Theren was listening. Really listening, like Cassian's words actually mattered. If you wish him to feel safe, Cassian continued, you must be the one who makes him so. Not servants, not guards. You. I brought him here, Theren said, something defensive in his tone. And then vanished for 3 days, Cassian countered, his voice gentler now despite himself. Theren didn't deny it. You command armies, Cassian said. Yet you fear a child's expectations. He believes I'm good, Theren said quietly, looking lost in a way that made him seem younger. Vulnerable. He looks at me like I'm a hero. But you don't agree? Cassian asked softly. Theron's gaze met his, and the intensity of it stole Cassian's breath. You tell me, Duke. Should I? The question hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Cassian's chest ache. A week ago the answer would have been simple. Absolute. No. Now, sitting here in the firelight, watching conflict play across Theron's scarred face, watching him struggle with wanting to be good for a child who needed him. I think, Cassian said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, that you could be. If you chose to be. Something passed between them in the silence that followed. Fragile and terrifying. Understanding maybe. Or the beginning of it. Theron's hand moved across the table, stopping just short of Cassian's. Close enough to feel the warmth. Not touching but almost. Thank you, Theren said. For walking with him today. For protecting him. Cassian looked at their hands so close and felt something shift inside his chest. Something dangerous. He's easy to protect, Cassian said. He sees good in everything. Even in me, Theren said quietly. Especially in you. Their eyes held, and Cassian thought, with growing alarm, that maybe the child wasn't the only one starting to see something good in the Alpha King. Chapter 5. A month had passed. Cassian stood at the corridor balcony overlooking the inner courtyard, telling himself he was simply taking air. He was not watching the king. He just happened to be standing here looking at the courtyard which happened to contain the king. Below, Theren knelt in the dirt beside Kian, dark hair falling forward as he bent to the child's level. Breathe, Theren said patient. Don't force it. Tell that to my wolf, Kian muttered, his small face scrunched in concentration. She's being very shy. Your wolf isn't a different person, little one, Theren said gently. She's part of you. Shifting just takes practice, that's all. Kian considered this with the grave seriousness he applied to everything. Maybe I'm shy then. And there it was. A sound Cassian had never heard from the Alpha King. Low and brief and real. A laugh. You didn't seem particularly shy, Theren said, and Cassian could hear the smile in his voice, when you hired me to find your brother. Kian giggled, and the sound floated up through the cold air like something warm. Cassian's chest tightened strangely. Kings didn't kneel in the dirt with children. Kings didn't laugh like that, open and unguarded. Kings didn't. Kings do not coddle children. The Queen Mother's voice cut through the courtyard like a blade. She stood at the far edge, wrapped in dark fur, her expression carved from ice. Theren didn't even look at her. Beats bending double and ruining my back. Don't you think? Kian laughed again, bright and delighted. The Queen Mother's eyes went to Kian, and the look on her face made Cassian's blood cool. Not displeasure, not irritation. Something calculating. Something that looked almost like threat assessment. Cassian filed it away and stepped back from the railing. He was almost back to his apartments when a small figure appeared at the corridor junction, planting herself directly in Cassian's path with both hands on his hips. "There you are," Kian announced. "Here I am," Cassian repeated, startled. "The king is free for dinner, and my brother always says families eat together." Kian's mismatched eyes were bright with determination. "So we should eat together." "We are not," Cassian attempted. But Kian had already taken his hand and was tugging, and Cassian found himself following. Because apparently he'd lost all ability to say no to this child. He found himself seated at the royal dining table before he entirely understood how he'd gotten there. The private chamber was smaller than the great hall. Firelight instead of chandeliers. Almost intimate. Theren sat at the head of the table wearing that particular expression he reserved for situations Kian had engineered. Somewhere between resigned and something softer. The Queen Mother sat to his right, her posture rigid with disapproval. Cassian sat across from Theren and reached for his wine. This was fine. This was perfectly normal. Just dinner. With his future husband and his future husband's adopted child and his future husband's terrifying mother. The first minutes passed in weighted silence. But Kian decided silence was unnecessary and began to fill it. "The new refugees who came today weren't scared," she said, helping herself to bread with both hands. "Not even the little ones." She looked at Theren with shining eyes. "I told them, the king is very kind. You'll be safe here." Theren said nothing, but something moved through his expression. Pleasure maybe. Or disbelief that someone thought him kind. Across the table, the Queen Mother's hand tightened around her goblet. Cassian watched her. The cold, deliberate way she tracked Kian's every word. The way her jaw worked when Theren smiled slightly at something Kian said. This wasn't merely disapproval. This was something territorial. Wine was poured. Theren drank his quickly. More quickly than Cassian expected, actually. Like he needed it. Kian was chattering about a late bloomer child who'd managed a partial shift that morning when the Queen Mother set down her silverware with a sharp click. "I find I've lost my appetite," she said, her gaze moving over Kian with restraint somehow worse than open hostility. "Good night," she rose. Theren didn't stand. Didn't acknowledge her departure beyond a slight tension in his jaw. When the doors closed behind her, the room breathed differently. Kian immediately reached for more bread. Theren leaned back slightly and even the fire seemed to settle. "She's very grumpy," Kian observed, completely unbothered. "Don't talk with your mouth full," Theren replied automatically. Kian swallowed obediently. "But didn't she seem grumpy to you?" "Not particularly." "She's always like this," Theren said, and there was something in his voice. "Old and tired. It's just how she is." Kian considered this, her expression solemn. "That's sad." "Yes," Theren said quietly. "It is." There was something in his voice, old and weary, that made Cassian look at him properly. Theren was staring at his goblet, turning it slowly, and in this light he looked exhausted. Like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long. "More wine?" Cassian asked before he could stop himself. Theren looked up, something shifting in his expression. Brief and unguarded. "Yes. Thank you." Cassian reached across and poured, and their eyes held for just a moment before Cassian looked away, his pulse doing something inconvenient. Kian was telling them about another late bloomer child, and Theren was listening, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. Cassian was reaching for his own wine when he noticed Theren's hand. Pressed flat against the table, fingers splayed, knuckles white. Something wasn't right. The quality of Theren's stillness had changed. Gone tense in a wrong way. "Your Majesty," Cassian said carefully. "Are you all right?" Theren didn't answer. When he looked up, his eyes were wrong. Darker than they should be in the firelight, pupils blown too wide. His breathing came slow and deliberate through his nose, like he was forcing it. "Are you tired?" Kian asked, concerned. You've been training everyone very hard. You should probably sleep more. Theren pushed back from the table suddenly, chair scraping loud against stone. Kian startled. He stood too quickly, unsteady. His hand caught the goblet, knocked it over. Wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood. You both need to leave, Theren said, voice strained, forcing the words through something. Now. Please. What's wrong? Kian cried, starting to rise. Kian. Cassian moved around the table fast, reaching for the child. Come with me. Now. But he was watching Theren as he moved. Theren's jaw clenched, unclenched. A tremor ran through his hands, visible and violent. His breathing came in harsh pulls, and his eyes had gone almost entirely dark, the green swallowed by black. Go, Theren managed. I can't. His body bent forward, hands slamming onto the table hard enough to crack the wood. Then the transformation took him. Nothing like the graceful shifts Cassian had seen from wolves in full control. This was violent. Bones cracking and reshaping too fast, muscle tearing and reforming, Theren's body fighting itself, fighting the change that came whether he wanted it or not. Kian screamed. Short and sharp. The massive black wolf crashed onto the stone floor, knocking the table sideways. Plates shattered across the ground. Food scattered everywhere. Cassian pulled Kian behind him, his heart slamming against his ribs. The wolf paced wrong. Jerky movements no healthy shifter made. Claws leaving deep grooves in the stone floor. Breath coming in harsh snarls, foam at its mouth. Eyes wild, unseeing, like something trapped inside its own skin. This wasn't controlled aggression. This wasn't an alpha asserting dominance. This was a man losing a fight with his own body. Come away, Cassian told Kian, stepping back slowly. Voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. Quickly and quietly. He needs help, Kian whispered. Maybe, Cassian said. But there's nothing we can do right now. The wolf snarled and its gaze fixed on Kian. Predatory. Hungry. Cassian put himself fully in front of the child on pure instinct. Kian, don't move. But Kian moved. She stepped out from behind Cassian and walked toward the wolf with steady, unhurried steps. Small and fearless and completely insane. No, Cassian started forward, but Kian was already there. It's okay, Kian said softly, not looking back. The wolf froze. Kian kept walking, arms loose at her sides, impossibly small in that ruined room in front of that creature. Cassian didn't breathe. His hand went to his belt, to the small knife he always carried, knowing it would do nothing against an alpha wolf but unable to just stand there. The snarl faded. The wolf's chest heaved once, twice. Then the breathing began to slow. The wildness in those dark eyes flickered, dimmed. The great body lowered itself to the ground. Kian reached out and placed her small hand against the wolf's muzzle. Stroking slowly, gently. You're okay, she whispered. You're safe. I'm here. The wolf's eyes closed. Cassian stood motionless, staring, his mind racing through everything he just witnessed. That wasn't alpha rage. That wasn't loss of control from emotion or stress. That was something else entirely. And Cassian was going to find out exactly what. Chapter 6. The room was quiet now. Kian had fallen asleep by the fire, curled against the wolf's warm flank like it was the most natural thing in the world. The wolf slept too, his great chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths. Cassian stood in the wrecked dining chamber alone with his thoughts. Theren had been fine. That was what Cassian couldn't stop turning over in his mind. Sitting at the table, talking entirely himself. And then within seconds gone. Like a man drowning inside his own body. This wasn't normal. Alphas didn't just lose control like that. Not without extreme provocation, not without threat or challenge or... Cassian's gaze went to the overturned goblet. Wine still pooling on the floor, soaking into the rug. He crossed to it and crouched, breathing in carefully. Red, spiced, slightly acidic. He held the scent in his lungs and searched for it. That edge of bitterness underneath the sweetness, the sharp chemical tang that didn't belong. Nothing he could name. But that didn't mean nothing was there. He moved to the food next, smelling everything in turn. The bread, the roasted meat, the vegetables. Still nothing. Which meant nothing necessarily. He was no alchemist. He couldn't identify every poison by scent alone. But he knew someone who could. Cassian went to the door and sent for Lady Dina. She arrived within 10 minutes, her gray hair pulled back, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. Cassian pulled her close and kept his voice barely above a whisper. Collect samples from everything on that table. Every dish, every goblet. Take them to the castle alchemist tonight. By order of the king. How official should this be? Dina asked quietly. Tell him to test for anything that shouldn't be there, Cassian said. Anything that would cause loss of control in an alpha. And send word to me privately. To no one else. How privately? To no one else, Cassian repeated. No one. Dina nodded and moved to the table without another word, producing small vials from her pockets like she'd been waiting for exactly this request. Good woman. Cassian turned back to Kian. The child was deeply asleep, face slack and peaceful against the wolf's side. He couldn't leave her here. Not like this. He crossed the room and crouched, sliding his arms carefully underneath her small body. Kian stirred, made a soft sound, then went slack against his chest. She weighed almost nothing. Too light for a child her age. Cassian stood, holding her, and looked toward the wolf. Behind him the wolf shifted. It happened fast, the sound of bones reforming, flesh reshaping. Cassian turned his face sharply away, giving Theren privacy for the transformation. He heard Dina finish collecting samples and slip out the door without being asked. Good woman, he thought again. Cassian carried Kian to the large carved chair in the far corner, lowered her carefully into the cushions. Then he turned back. He immediately wished he hadn't. Theren lay on his side by the fire, deeply unconscious, and the firelight was doing absolutely nothing to help Cassian's situation. Broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist, muscle carved from years of actual warfare, not ceremonial sparring. The firelight moved across his skin in warm gold, catching on old scars on the rise and fall of his ribs. Cassian looked at the ceiling. Then at the door. Then, against his better judgment, back at Theren. His cheeks were burning. This was ridiculous. He was a grown man, a duke, he'd seen naked people before. This was just skin. Just a body. Just the most beautiful alpha he'd ever seen in his life, and wasn't that an inconvenient realization? If a guard walked in right now and found the king like this, unconscious on the floor, the room in ruins, by morning the entire fortress would believe he'd drunk himself into a stupor. Which was probably exactly what someone wanted people to think. Cassian found Theren's cloak near the door and walked back, keeping his eyes fixed on his own hands as he crouched beside the king. He began draping the heavy fabric across Theren's body, covering him. He was doing well. Very professional. Very controlled. Then he made the mistake of breathing in. Theren's scent enveloped him. Pine and smoke and warm skin, distinctly alpha in a way that made Cassian's beta instincts go quiet and still. The way they only did when they recognized something worth paying attention to. Cassian made the further mistake of glancing at Theren's face. His eyes were open. Green and heavy-lidded and very, very close. Theren looked at him like people looked at things they wanted. Soft and unguarded and without a single wall up, and Cassian's heart stopped completely. Then Theren lifted his hand, slow and deliberate, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Cassian's ear. His fingers lingered against Cassian's cheek. Cassian, Theren said. His voice was rough, slurred with whatever had been in his system. And he smiled. Actually smiled, warm and real and devastating. Every coherent thought Cassian possessed evaporated simultaneously. He cleared his throat and sat back. Your Majesty. Theren blinked slowly, like he was surfacing from deep water. Cassian watched awareness return. The warmth retreating, recognition arriving, then the full weight of memory landing all at once. Theren's eyes swept the ruined room. His face went pale. Where is Kian? His voice cracked. Safe, Cassian said quickly, nodding toward the corner. Sleeping. Theren found the small figure in the chair and the breath left him in a long, broken exhale. I could have. He stopped. Started again. Did I hurt anyone? No, Cassian said firmly. You didn't. Theren closed his eyes. I'm sorry. For earlier. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the room, at everything. All of this. What happened? Cassian asked. Shame crossed Theren's face. The last thing Cassian had expected from him. It happens to me sometimes, Theren said, looking away. I lose control. Can't stop it. Ever since I was young. Cassian stared at him. That didn't fit. He'd spent months watching this man. Theren's control over his body in the training yard was extraordinary. The precision, the discipline. This wasn't the portrait of someone who lost control easily. The fighting helps, Theren said quietly. It channels it, gives it somewhere to go. He looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. The violence, the wars. It made sense of it somehow. He was ashamed. Deeply, fundamentally ashamed in a way that suggested he'd been carrying this belief about himself for years. That he was broken. That the violence was his fault, his failing, his flaw. So all these wars, Cassian said carefully, they were your way of managing your temperament? No. Theron's eyes came up sharply. Not exactly. I didn't. He turned away. Maybe it felt good. Knowing there was a way to stop everything while being useful. While being useful, Cassian repeated softly. Theren met his eyes. While making the brokenness mean something. Cassian felt the sharp response rise in him. The names of cities, the faces of his people, 3 years of war. He saw Theren register it in his expression, saw him brace himself for the condemnation. But Cassian stopped. Because he saw it suddenly. A boy who'd been told there was something wrong with him. Who'd found one story that made the wrongness feel like purpose. And who had never been given a reason to question any of it. I would think, Cassian said sternly but not angrily, that there might be other ways. Better ways. Theren nodded, slow and heavy, like something long refused was finally being acknowledged. Wars cannot last forever, Cassian added quietly. No, Theren said. I suppose they can't. The fire settled softly. The room felt very small and very warm. Cassian became aware of how close they were. Theren on the floor, Cassian crouched beside him, barely a foot between them. Did I scare you? Theren asked. Earlier. Yes, Cassian said honestly. Theron's face tightened. He looked away. You didn't scare Kian though, Cassian said quickly. She was scared but not of you. She was scared for you. Theren looked at Kian, sleeping peacefully. Cassian found himself smiling slightly. She walked right up to you and put her hand on your face. And you just stopped. Other ways, Theren murmured almost to himself. Children have a way of changing things, Cassian agreed. Theren turned to look at him, and the firelight caught in his eyes, and Cassian thought about the marriage contract sitting in his rooms. About how someday he'd be expected to share Theron's bed to give him heirs. Heat rushed up his neck. Or so I hear, Cassian said quickly looking away. Comfortable silence settled between them. Almost peaceful. Then Theron's expression changed. Darkened. What will you do? Cassian asked quietly. When her brother comes back? Theren tensed immediately. He won't. He might, Cassian pressed gently. He's her brother. From everything she says he loves her. So when he comes. Her brother is dead, Theren said, meeting Cassian's eyes directly. I know because I watched him die. Cassian went very still. Chapter 7. During the war, Theren said, his voice dropping lower, commanding troops is difficult when everyone around you has been trained into total obedience. They say yes to everything. It's efficient. Useful. He paused. But there are moments when you need someone to tell you what they actually think. Not what they calculate you want to hear. Cassian said nothing. Just waited. There was a soldier, Theren continued. Dorian Ashford. He said the name carefully like it was precious. Common man. Nothing remarkable on paper. But he was the only person in my entire army who told me exactly what he thought. Every time. Without checking whether it would cost him. He wasn't afraid of you, Cassian said softly. No. Theren seemed to find this both baffling and genuinely precious. He'd look me dead in the eye and say, I think that's wrong, Your Majesty. And here's why. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Theron's hands tightened on the cloak. I started seeking him out. Asking his opinion. It was nice. To discuss things I might have missed otherwise. You became friends, Cassian said. Theren was quiet for a long moment. I wouldn't know how to recognize that, he said finally. I've never really had friends. He said it simply. No self-pity, just fact. He talked about his little brother every spare moment, Theren continued. Talked about Kian like the boy was the sun and moon and stars. Like everything else was just the thing he was doing until he could get back home. The fire crackled quietly between them. It made me realize there was no one waiting for me, Theren said. No reason to come home except duty. Cassian looked at his profile and felt something ache behind his ribs. One day there was another battle, Theren said, his voice going careful. In the southern pass above the Arden Valley. Late autumn. The ground already frozen hard. I'd moved our supply lines through the past 3 days running. I thought we'd established it as secured. Cassian held very still. The Arden Valley. He knew that pass. He'd spent 2 weeks with his father's best military minds designing what would happen there. The false signal fires on the ridge, the decoy wagon tracks leading north. Dorian had been watching the ridge line for 2 days, Theren said. The morning before he told me something was wrong. Asked me to change the route. Theron's jaw tightened. I told him he was reading shadows. Cassian said nothing. His heart beat very hard. We were halfway through the pass when the first wave came down. They'd been waiting above us. Completely invisible. The second wave cut off the rear before anyone could turn. He looked at Cassian quietly and there was recognition in his eyes. Quiet. Carrying no accusation. Simply knowing. It was well conceived, that ambush, Theren said. The timing, the terrain, the way it prevented retreat. Cassian's throat was tight. He'd been so proud of that plan. So certain it would work, that it would turn the tide, that his people would finally have a chance against the unstoppable Alpha King. I would have died, Theren said simply. Dorian was 10 feet away. He had no reason to be watching me at that particular second. But he was. Theren looked at his hands. He moved before the arrow did. The decision he made in that moment, he must have understood exactly what he was choosing. And he chose it anyway. Theron's voice went rough. He wasn't afraid. I sat with him while he was dying and he wasn't afraid. He was concerned about whether I was injured. He said I had to live because I would do more good than he could. Cassian closed his eyes. Oh gods. And then he asked me to find his little brother, Theren said, barely above a whisper. He told me Kian's name. Where he'd be waiting. The milestone on the north road. He said Kian had eyes like his, one amber, one gray, so I'd know him. The silence was absolute. Cassian looked at the small figure sleeping under the tapestry in the corner. Oh, he whispered. You asked who Kian is to me, Theren said. He's the guilt I carry. If it weren't for me, Kian would still have a brother. If I'd just listened. Cassian reached out and placed his hand on Theron's arm. The skin was warm under his palm. Theren looked down at Cassian's hand, then slowly up at his face. Raw and unguarded and entirely without armor. A small sound came from the corner. They both turned. Kian sat upright in the chair, her mismatched eyes wide and fixed on Theren. Her face was very pale. Kian, Theren said carefully, starting to rise. You should be. He's dead. Kian's voice was small. Broken. Dorian is dead. Theren held her gaze and nodded once. Because of you. He nodded again. Kian's small face moved through it. Grief and shock and confusion breaking across her features like waves. Then it crumpled entirely and she burst into tears and ran for the door. Theren was on his feet instantly, the cloak barely held around him. Stop. Cassian caught his arm. She needs a moment. She needs. Look at yourself, Cassian said gently. You cannot chase a child through the corridors like this. And she needs to breathe. You know that. Theren stood very still, staring at the closed door like it was taking everything in him not to follow. His whole body was tense, trembling with the effort of staying still. Let her breathe, Cassian said softly. It won't help if you go after her right now. Theren turned away from the door slowly, like it cost him something physical. He sat back down by the fire heavily and Cassian sat beside him. Close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Neither of them spoke. Cassian thought about the ambush. About the soldier who died because of plans Cassian had helped make. About the child sleeping in a warm bed because an enemy had kept a promise to a dying man. Nothing was simple anymore. I'm sorry, Cassian said quietly. About your friend. Theron's jaw worked. I'm sorry about your kingdom. They sat there in the ruins of the dining room, in the firelight, in the space between what they'd been and what they were becoming. We're a mess, Cassian said finally. Yes, Theren agreed. We are. Outside, somewhere in the dark corridors, a child was crying for a brother who would never come home. And in this room, 2 men sat in the wreckage trying to figure out how to build something from the pieces. Cassian thought about the samples Dina had taken. About the Queen Mother's cold eyes tracking Kian's every movement. About the way Theren had lost control so completely, so violently. Something was very wrong in this fortress. And Cassian was going to find out what. But for now he stayed where he was. Shoulder to shoulder with the king who was learning how to be human. Waiting for a child to come back when she was ready. The fire burned low. Neither of them moved. "She'll come back," Cassian said eventually. "How do you know?" Theren asked. "Because she loves you," Cassian said simply. "And love doesn't disappear just because it hurts." Theren looked at him, something complicated moving through his expression. Then he nodded and went back to staring at the fire. They waited together in the quiet. Chapter 8. Kian didn't understand. That was the part that kept her curled behind the heavy curtain on the third floor, knees pulled to her chest, face pressed against the cold window glass. She'd been sitting here since before the sun came up, and she still didn't understand. Dorian was dead. Except Dorian couldn't be dead because Dorian was Dorian. Dorian was the one who fixed things. Who fixed the broken chair leg in their room and fixed the way Kian felt when he was scared by putting his big warm hand on top of his head and saying, "I've got you, little star." But dead people couldn't do that. Dead people couldn't come home. So Dorian couldn't be dead because he'd promised he was coming home. He'd said it. Knelt down right in front of Kian and said, "I will come home to you." Dorian wouldn't break a promise. Except Theren had said it. Had nodded twice. Like he knew. Kian pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. How could both things be true? How could Dorian have promised and Theren have nodded? He kept trying to find the piece he was missing. Like when you had a puzzle and there was one piece that didn't seem to go anywhere and you kept turning it over and over. There had to be a place where this fit. Dorian was coming home. The war was over. The war being over meant soldiers came home. That was how wars worked. That was the whole point of wars ending. A sound came out of Kian that he hadn't meant to make. Small and broken and embarrassing. He pressed his fist against his mouth. "Don't cry. Dorian says crying doesn't fix anything." Kian folded forward over his knees and cried as quietly as he could. He didn't understand. He didn't understand and it wasn't fair and he wanted Dorian. Wanted his brother so badly it felt like something tearing inside his chest. "Child?" came a voice. Kian's head snapped up. The curtain had been pulled aside and the Queen Mother was crouching there. Which was completely unexpected because the Queen Mother did not crouch. She barely looked at Kian most days. But right now she was crouched at Kian's level and her face was kind. Kian blinked, confused, his cheeks wet. "Poor little thing," the Queen Mother said quietly and her voice was gentle. Soft. Kian wiped his nose on his sleeve. "I don't." "I know," the Queen Mother said. "I know what they told you last night." Kian swallowed hard. "I've been looking for you," the Queen Mother continued. "I wanted to find you because..." She paused and her expression did something soft. Warm. "Because I have something to tell you, Kian." Kian's heart stuttered. "Your brother is not dead." The words went into Kian's ears and then just stopped. Like they didn't make sense. Like they were in a language he didn't speak. "What?" he whispered. "He's alive." The Queen Mother's mouth curved into a warm smile. "Dorian lives, little one. And I know exactly where he is." Something happened in Kian's chest. It was like when you'd been holding your breath underwater for a very long time and someone finally told you that you could breathe. Dorian was alive. "My brother is alive?" Kian's voice came out tiny and trembling. "Yes." The Queen Mother reached out and cupped Kian's wet cheek. "And he misses you terribly." Kian's eyes filled again. The good kind now. The overwhelmed kind. "I knew it," he breathed. The words tumbled out before he could even think them, straight from somewhere deep and certain. "I knew it. I knew Dorian wouldn't," he promised. He promised he'd come back and Dorian never breaks promises. "I knew." "Would you like to go to him?" the Queen Mother asked gently. Kian was already scrambling out from behind the curtain. Already moving toward the stairs. His heart was so full it hurt, pounding against his ribs like it wanted to break free. Dorian was alive. Dorian was alive and waiting for him and everything was going to be okay. He was halfway down the back stairs when the thought hit him and he stopped dead. "Theren. First let's go tell the king," Kian said, turning back. "He'll be so relieved. He's been so sad about..." "Kian." The Queen Mother's voice was gentle, patient. "The king loves you very much. You know that, don't you?" "Yes," Kian said immediately. "He wants to keep you here with him, the Queen Mother said, her expression shifting into something careful. "Sir, he told you your brother had died so that you would stay." Kian stood on the step and looked at the Queen Mother's kind face and tried to make those words fit inside the shape of Theren he kept in his chest. They didn't fit. "He wouldn't lie to me," Kian said. "He loves you," the Queen Mother said simply. "People do foolish things when they're afraid of losing someone they love." Kian thought about Theron's face last night. The pain in it when he talked about Dorian. The way his voice broke. "If you want to see your brother," the Queen Mother said gently, "we must go now." And quietly. "If the king knows you're leaving, he will stop you." Kian's whole heart resisted this. "But if I just disappear without saying anything, he'll think I'm angry." "I'm not angry. He'll be sad." The Queen Mother's face softened. "And what about Duke Cassian? Won't he worry?" "Your brother," the Queen Mother said softly, "is sitting somewhere cold and alone right now, believing he will never see you again." Kian thought about Dorian waiting. Dorian thinking Kian wasn't coming. Dorian believing he'd been forgotten. "Once you're with him again," the Queen Mother added gently, "you can send word. Explain. They'll understand." Kian looked back up the stairs toward Theron's room somewhere above him. He thought about the king's tired eyes, the way he'd been so patient teaching Kian about shifting. The way he'd held Kian when Kian had nightmares. But he thought about Dorian's face too. About his brother's smile and his laugh and the way he called Kian Little Star. Kian took the Queen Mother's hand. "All right," he whispered. "But I'll come back later. To explain." "Of course," the Queen Mother said warmly. "Of course you will." They went through the garden first. Kian glanced back at the palace as they passed through the outer gate, at the windows where maybe Theren was sleeping, where maybe Duke Cassian was reading. "I'll be back," he thought. "I'll explain everything and they'll understand and we'll all be together." He turned and followed the Queen Mother. The grounds beyond the gate were frost-hardened, the tended paths giving way to scrubby bushes and then gradually to trees. Kian had to take quick steps to keep up. "Is it far?" Kian asked. "Not terribly," the Queen Mother said pleasantly. The path narrowed, then narrowed further, then became something more like a deer track. A gap between trees where animals had passed rather than people. They walked long enough that Kian lost all sense of the palace behind him. No distant bells, no guards calling changes, nothing. Long enough that the excited fluttering in his chest had settled into patient certainty. Dorian was just ahead. Waiting. The trees opened into a clearing. Kian looked around eagerly. A small space, snow still lying in the shadows at the edges where the sun hadn't reached. Bare earth in the center, frozen hard. Empty. Kian frowned. The clearing was completely empty. The snow at the edges was undisturbed. Nobody had been here. "Where is he?" Kian asked, turning to the Queen Mother. "Where's Dorian?" The Queen Mother reached behind her and lifted a bough from where it had been hidden against her back. Kian looked at it, his mind feeling strange. Slow and fast at once. "Where is my brother?" Kian asked carefully. The Queen Mother said nothing. She notched an arrow with practiced ease. The shaft was black, the tip darker still, coated with something that gleamed wet in the pale light. Kian's back found a tree. "I don't understand." "History remembers victory," the Queen Mother said quietly, conversationally. "It never remembers mercy." Kian shook his head. He didn't understand what that meant. "Dorian," he called out, looking around desperately because he was scared now and he wanted his brother. "Dorian, please?" "Did you know, little one," the Queen Mother said, tilting the arrow to examine it, "that this arrow bears the mark of the southern province?" Kian shook his head again, pressed flat against the tree trunk. "Your death will restart the war," the Queen Mother said pleasantly, "and restore proper order to this kingdom." "Why would you restart the war?" Kian whispered. His chin was wobbling. "It hurts people." "War makes kingdoms strong," the Queen Mother said. "It makes my son's reign powerful. And I will not have a foolish little Omega and a conquered Duke dismantle what I have spent his entire life building." Kian's eyes were filling with tears. "Please," he whispered. "I want Dorian. I just want my brother." The Queen Mother shook her head slowly, almost gently. "You'll be with him soon, child?" And something in the way she said it made Kian's heart lift for just one small, terrible second. Then the Queen Mother drew the bow back. "You'll join him in death." The string pulled taut. Kian pressed himself against the tree and did the only thing he had left. "Dorian," he screamed. The word tore out of him. "Dorian, please?" His voice came back from the trees. Just his voice. Nothing else. The silence settled around him like snow on stone. And something in Kian's chest that had been holding on finally let go. Dorian wasn't coming. Dorian was really gone. He was alone in a forest and the Queen Mother had an arrow aimed at his heart and nobody knew where he was. "Theren!" Kian yelled. The scream ripped out of him just as the Queen Mother released the arrow. Chapter 9. The arrow didn't touch him. Something hit Kian sideways first. Enormous and solid and fast. He flew through the air and hit the snow at the clearing's edge hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, stunned, gasping. Then he heard it. A sound he'd heard once before in the dining room. A cry that started as a snarl and broke apart in the middle, raw and ragged and wrong. Kian scrambled to his knees. The massive black wolf stood in the center of the clearing, right where Kian had been seconds ago. The black arrow was buried deep in his shoulder, the fletching still trembling from impact. "No," Kian breathed. He was across the clearing before he decided to move, throwing himself against the wolf's neck, his small arms wrapping around all that fur and muscle. "You're fine," he said into the black fur. His voice was shaking. "You're fine, you're fine." The wolf's legs shook beneath him. Kian could feel them shaking, those enormous legs that had always seemed so strong and steady. Then they buckled. The wolf went down slowly. First the front legs, then the back. Kian went down with him, refusing to let go. The wolf's breathing was wrong. Too slow, too far apart, each breath a struggle. "Stand up," Kian said. Came out barely sound at all. "Stand up, please." The wolf didn't stand. His green eyes found Kian's face and they were already starting to glaze. "Please," Kian whispered. "Please don't." The forest erupted. Duke Cassian came through the trees like wind, boots loud on frozen ground. Behind him, soldiers. Many of them, fast and purposeful, spreading out across the clearing. The guards surrounded the Queen Mother in seconds. She didn't even try to run, just stood there with the bow still in her hand, her face calm. Cassian's eyes swept everything in 1 second. The Queen Mother, the bow, Kian on the ground, the fallen wolf with an arrow in his shoulder. "Guards," Cassian called, his voice controlled but carrying an edge like broken glass. "Seize her." They did. Hands on the Queen Mother's arms, pulling the bow away, forcing her to her knees. "Unhand me," the Queen Mother said coldly. "Unhand you?" Cassian's voice went sharp. "After you tried to murder a child under the king's protection? After you've been poisoning your own son?" Kian looked up sharply. "Poisoning?" "It was an accident," the Queen Mother said smoothly. "The king has always been unstable. Everyone knows." "Was it an accident," Cassian interrupted, "that you've been drugging him his entire life to make him think he had uncontrollable bursts of violence when it isn't true?" Kian stared at Cassian, then at the Queen Mother. Fury flashed in the Queen Mother's eyes. Real emotion finally. "You can't prove it." "Oh yes I can," Cassian replied. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. "The alchemist's report. Traces of nightshade root in the king's wine. In specific doses, it causes violent shifts, loss of control, aggression the victim can't understand or prevent." Kian's hands tightened in the wolf's fur. All those times Theren had said he was broken. That he couldn't control himself. That the violence was just part of who he was. It had all been a lie. Or lie. "Theren will not believe it," the Queen Mother argued, but her voice had lost its certainty. "He will," Cassian said. "You tried to hurt Kian. He'll never forgive you for that." The Queen Mother's face twisted. "Mercy weakens kings," she screamed. "Weakens empires. You will all thank me someday when." The guards dragged her backward. Her screaming was swallowed by the trees as they hauled her away. Cassian crouched in the snow beside Kian immediately. "Are you hurt?" Kian shook his head. He couldn't speak. His throat was too tight. "It wasn't your fault," Cassian said quietly, his hand gentle on Kian's shoulder. "None of this was your fault." Kian thought about Dorian teaching him about trust. About kind eyes meaning good hearts. About how you could tell the ones worth trusting because they kept showing up when things got hard. Theren had shown up. Even drugged, even poisoned, even with an arrow meant for Kian buried in his shoulder. He'd shown up. Kian pressed his face into the wolf's fur. "You came," he whispered. "You came for me." The wolf's breathing was getting worse. Slower. Each exhale longer than the last. "We need to move him," Cassian said, already rising, his voice shifting into command. "Someone fetch the healer. Now. Go now." Guards scattered. Cassian knelt again, his hands hovering over the arrow, assessing. "Kian, I need you to step back." "No," Kian said. "The arrow is poisoned. If we don't, I'm not leaving him." Kian's voice came out stronger than he felt. "He didn't leave me." Cassian's expression softened. "All right. But when I say move, you move. Understood?" Kian nodded. More soldiers arrived. A makeshift stretcher, carefully assembled. Cassian directed them with calm efficiency, and Kian realized the Duke had done this before. Had moved wounded soldiers off battlefields, had made these exact decisions under pressure. They lifted the massive wolf with agonizing care. The wolf made a sound, low and pained, and Kian's heart cracked. "You're okay," Kian whispered, walking alongside the stretcher, his hand never leaving the black fur. "You're going to be okay. You have to be okay." Because Kian had lost Dorian. He couldn't lose Theren too. The wolf's green eyes found his again, and Kian saw something in them. Recognition. Gratitude. An apology maybe. "Don't," Kian said fiercely. "Don't you dare apologize. You saved me. You're a hero." The wolf's eyes closed. "No," Kian said. "No, stay awake. Stay with me. Please." Cassian's hand squeezed Kian's shoulder as they moved through the forest. Fast as they dared. The palace rising in the distance, still so far away. Kian's tears fell into black fur, and he didn't bother wiping them away. "Please," he whispered. "Please don't leave me. You promised to take care of me. You promised." The wolf's chest rose and fell. Rose and fell. They burst through the palace gates. Healers were already waiting, summoned by the guards who'd run ahead. A flurry of movement, of voices, of hands carefully removing the arrow, cleaning the wound, applying poultices and bandages. Kian stood to the side, Cassian's hand still on his shoulder, and watched them work. "He's strong," Cassian said quietly. "He'll survive this." "How do you know?" Kian asked, his voice very small. "Because he has something to live for now," Cassian said, looking down at Kian. "He has you." The healers worked through the night. Kian refused to leave, curled up in a chair beside the massive wolf, one hand resting on his fur. Cassian stayed too. Sitting in the other chair, keeping watch, making sure Kian ate something even when he said he wasn't hungry. And somewhere deep in the fortress, locked in a cell where she belonged, the Queen Mother screamed about order and strength and the weakness of mercy. But up here in the healing room, Kian held onto the wolf's fur and whispered, "Thank you for coming. Thank you for choosing me." The wolf's breathing steadied. Slowly it evened out. And Kian, exhausted beyond measure, finally closed his eyes. When he woke, everything would be different. But for now, he slept with his hand in a hero's fur, and dreamed of brothers who kept their promises even after death. Chapter 10. Theren had been unconscious for 3 days, and Cassian had filled every hour with tasks. Because tasks were the only thing standing between him and the particular kind of fear he refused to examine too closely. He'd met with the council every morning. Presented the alchemist's evidence, watched their faces go pale as they realized what the Queen Mother had done. Decades of manipulation, of poisoning her own son to keep him controllable, to maintain her vision of a war-hungry kingdom. The council had voted unanimously. The Queen Mother would be stripped of all titles and confined for life. Cassian had overseen it personally. Made sure the guards understood she was never to be released, never to have access to anything that could be used as a weapon. She'd screamed the entire time about weakness and soft hearts and the death of proper order. Cassian had felt nothing but cold satisfaction watching the cell door close. But in the quiet moments he couldn't fill with work, he found himself thinking about green eyes and a voice saying his name in the dark. About broad shoulders and careful hands and the way Theren had looked at Kian with such desperate tenderness. He pushed the thought away every time. But it kept coming back. On the 4th morning, Cassian went to Theren's chambers. Kian was curled in the chair beside the bed, her small face pale and still in a way that worried Cassian more than crying would have. The child had barely spoken since the forest. Just sat there watching Theren's chest rise and fall, waiting. Beside her, Theren lay motionless under heavy blankets, his breathing slow and shallow. The healers had been cautiously optimistic, which was the worst kind of optimistic. The poison had been strong, the wound deep. Could go either way. Cassian settled into the chair on Kian's other side without speaking. He's going to be fine, Cassian said quietly. Kian said nothing. Kian, Cassian tried again. It's my fault, Kian murmured, so quiet Cassian almost missed it. I went with her. I should have known. Everyone trusted her, Cassian interrupted gently. She was the Queen Mother. She'd been here for decades. How were you supposed to know? Kian looked up and her mismatched eyes were red-rimmed. You didn't trust her. Cassian opened his mouth. Closed it. No, he admitted. I didn't. Why not? Because I trust no one, Cassian said. It came out harsher than he meant. He softened his voice. It's kept me alive this long. Kian studied him. Not even me? Something in Cassian's chest twisted. He put his arm around the small shoulders and pulled Kian close. All right, he said. Perhaps I trust you. A little bit. Kian leaned into him and they sat like that for a while. Quiet. Waiting. Then Theren stirred. His brow creased like someone fighting their way up from somewhere deep and dark. His hand moved against the blanket, fingers flexing. Kian was out of the chair before Cassian could breathe. Theren. She stopped herself just short of throwing herself at him, remembering at the last second that he was injured. Theron's eyes opened slowly. Unfocused at first, then clearing. They found Kian immediately and something in his expression cracked open. He smiled. Small and tired and entirely real. Cassian felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, sharp and overwhelming. Kian couldn't stop herself then. She threw her arms around Theron's neck, making him wince. Cassian was already moving forward to pull her back, but Theren caught his eye and shook his head slightly. Theron's arms came up, slow and clearly painful, and wrapped around Kian. Held her close. I'm sorry, Kian said into his shoulder, the words tumbling out fast. I'm so sorry. I should have told you I was leaving. I should have known she was lying. I should have. No, Theren said, his voice rough but steady. It was my fault. I should have seen what my mother was doing long before this. His eyes moved to Cassian over Kian's head, and there was something in that look. Warmth and gratitude and a question he didn't ask out loud. Cassian nodded once. The evidence is presented. She's locked away. You're safe now. Theron's expression shifted. Relief, then something darker. Cassian watched memory return, watched Theren piece together what must have happened. You came after me, Kian said, pulling back to look at Theron's face. You saved me. Of course I did, Theren said simply. But you got hurt. Better me than you. Kian's eyes filled with tears again. I thought, when you wouldn't wake up, I thought maybe you'd. Her voice broke. Theren cupped her face gently with one hand. I'm here. I'm all right. The healers said it was close, Kian whispered. But I'm here, Theren repeated. And I'm not going anywhere. Kian buried her face against his shoulder again, and Theren just held her. Patient. Steady. Cassian started to stand to give them privacy, but Theron's voice stopped him. Stay. Cassian froze. You need rest. I should. Please, Theren said. Stay. So Cassian sat back down. Watched Theren hold Kian, watched the child finally start to cry properly. Not the silent tears from before, but real sobs that shook her whole body. Theren looked at Cassian over Kian's head, and his expression was lost. Help me, it said. I don't know what to do. Let her cry, Cassian said softly. She needs this. So they did. Theren held her while she cried for her brother, for the fear in the forest, for everything. And Cassian sat beside them both, one hand on Kian's back, the other resting on the edge of Theron's bed. Eventually Kian's sobs quieted. Her breathing evened out. She'd cried herself to sleep against Theron's chest. Theren looked down at her with an expression of such profound tenderness that Cassian had to look away. Thank you, Theren said quietly. For finding us. For saving her. I didn't save her, Cassian said. You did. How did you know? That we were gone. A servant saw you leaving through the garden gate with my mother, Cassian said. She came to me immediately. I knew something was wrong. Theron's jaw tightened. The poison. You found evidence. The alchemist confirmed it. Nightshade root in your wine, administered regularly over years. Cassian's voice went hard. She made you think you were broken when you weren't. Something flickered across Theron's face. Too many emotions to name. Anger, relief, grief, all tangled together. I'm sorry, Cassian said. Don't be. Theren looked at Kian sleeping against him. If she hadn't done what she did, I wouldn't have become this. Wouldn't have won the war. Wouldn't have found Kian. He paused. Wouldn't have met you. Cassian's breath caught. I don't regret what I am, Theren continued quietly. I regret what I believed about myself. That I was too broken to be anything but a weapon. You were never broken, Cassian said. Theron's eyes found his. No. No. You were poisoned. There's a difference. They looked at each other, and the air between them felt charged. Heavy with things neither of them were saying. She tried to kill Kian to restart the war, Theren said, and his voice went cold. To frame your people. I know. She wanted me to be nothing but a conqueror. Forever. But you're not, Cassian said. You're choosing something different now. Am I? Theren asked. Or am I just afraid of what I'll become without the fighting? Cassian leaned forward. You already know what you'll become. You're becoming it right now. A father. A king who shows mercy. Someone who kneels for children and changes policy because it's the right thing to do. Theron's hand tightened on Kian's back. That's what she wanted? For Kian and me? For Kian, yes. Cassian hesitated. And for us. Us, Theren repeated softly. The word hung in the air between them. Cassian's heart was beating too fast. This was dangerous territory. They were still technically engaged, still bound by that contract, but everything felt different now. Fragile and new and terrifying. I should let you rest, Cassian said, starting to rise again. This time Theron's hand caught his wrist. Gentle but firm. Don't go, Theren said. Not yet. So Cassian stayed. Sat back down in the chair while Theren held Kian with one arm and kept his other hand wrapped around Cassian's wrist. And maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the relief of Theren being alive. Maybe it was something else entirely. But Cassian turned his hand over and laced his fingers through Theron's. Theron's breath hitched. They sat like that. Connected. While Kian slept between them and the morning light crept through the windows. When I'm better, Theren said eventually, I'd like to talk. About the engagement. About what you want. What I want? Cassian asked. You never chose this, Theren said. The contract was forced on you. So when I'm better we'll discuss it properly. And if you want to leave, if you want to go home to your people, I won't stop you. Cassian's throat went tight. A month ago he would have taken that offer without hesitation. Would have run back to the southern province and never looked back. Now, let's talk when you're better, Cassian said carefully. Theren nodded. His thumb stroked across Cassian's knuckles, probably without realizing he was doing it. Cassian didn't pull away. They stayed like that until a healer came to check Theron's wounds. Until Kian woke up rubbing her eyes. Until the world intruded again with all its demands and responsibilities. But for those few quiet moments, it was just the three of them. And Cassian thought maybe, just maybe, this could be something like home. Chapter 11. 2 weeks later, Theren was finally cleared to leave his chambers. The healers had fussed and worried, but the wound was healing clean. The poison was out of his system. And more importantly, he was restless. Kian had barely left his side the entire time. She'd taken to sleeping in the chair by his bed, even though Cassian kept trying to coax her back to her own room. She'd wake up every few hours to check that Theren was still breathing, still there. It broke something in Theren every time he woke to find her watching him with those worried, mismatched eyes. This morning was different though. Kian had finally slept through the night in her own bed, and Theren had woken to find Cassian sitting in the chair instead. Reading some report, his dark hair falling forward, morning light catching on his profile. Theren had lain there for a long moment just watching him. Wondering when exactly Cassian had stopped being the enemy and started being this. Whatever this was. I can feel you staring, Cassian said without looking up. I'm not staring. You absolutely are. Cassian finally glanced over, and there was something almost like amusement in his eyes. How are you feeling? Like I've been in bed for 2 weeks. That's because you have been. Exactly. Theren pushed himself up carefully. The wound pulled but didn't hurt like it had. I need to move. Or something. Cassian set down his papers. The healers said. The healers said I could resume light activity. Theren was already standing, reaching for proper clothes instead of the sleep shirt he'd been wearing. Walking is light activity. Stubborn, Cassian muttered, but he was standing too. Fine. But I'm coming with you. I don't need a nursemaid. No, you need someone to catch you when you inevitably overdo it and fall on your face. Theren wanted to argue, but Cassian was probably right. So he just nodded and finished dressing. They walked through the corridors slowly. Theron's legs felt weak, unsteady. He hated it. Hated feeling vulnerable like this. But Cassian stayed beside him, not hovering, just present. Ready to help if needed, but not assuming Theren couldn't manage. They ended up in the garden courtyard. Snow had melted in patches, revealing dark earth underneath. Spring was coming, Theren realized. He'd been so focused on survival, on war, on maintaining control that he'd stopped noticing seasons. Sit, Cassian said, gesturing to a bench. Theren sat gratefully. His shoulder ached, but it was a good ache. Healing ache, not poison ache. Cassian sat beside him. Close enough that their shoulders almost touched. I need to tell Kian, Theren said abruptly. About Dorian. Properly. Cassian was quiet for a moment. She knows he's dead. She knows he died. She doesn't know how he lived. Theren looked at his hands. She doesn't know what kind of man her brother was. What he meant to people. What he meant to me. You want to tell her stories? Cassian said softly. I want her to know him, Theren said. Even if only through my memories. He was good, Cassian. Truly good. Not the way people pretend to be good for advantage. Just good because that's who he was. Cassian's hand found Theren's. Squeezed once. Then tell her. She'll want to know. What if it makes it worse? What if? It won't, Cassian said with certainty. Knowing her brother was loved, that he mattered, that he made a difference, that will help. Trust me. Theren nodded. Cassian's hand was still in his, warm and steady. I've been thinking, Cassian said carefully. About what you said. About discussing the engagement properly. Theren's chest tightened. Here it was. Cassian was going to leave. Of course he was. Why would he stay with the man who destroyed his kingdom? Even if that man was trying to be better now. I don't want to go home, Cassian said. Theren's head snapped up. What? I said I don't want to go home. Cassian was looking straight ahead, not at Theren. His jaw was tight. My home is rubble. My father is dead. My people are scattered. There's nothing there anymore. Cassian. But that's not why I'm staying. Cassian turned to look at him finally. I'm staying because I want to. Because somehow in the middle of all this mess, you and that impossible child became something I don't want to walk away from. Theren couldn't breathe. You want to stay. I want to stay, Cassian confirmed. If you'll have me. Not as a political prisoner or a trophy or proof of your conquest. As. He trailed off, and Theren saw vulnerability in those dark eyes. Saw Cassian struggling with the same thing Theren was struggling with. As my partner, Theren finished quietly. My equal. My choice. Cassian's breath hitched. Your choice. My choice, Theren repeated. He turned on the bench, wincing as his shoulder protested. I know I don't deserve. Stop, Cassian interrupted. Stop saying you don't deserve things. You're not your mother's puppet anymore. You're not the weapon she made you believe you were. You're just Theren. And I. He took a breath. I'm choosing you too. Not because I have to. Because I want to. They stared at each other. The garden was quiet around them, just the sound of melting snow dripping from branches. I don't know how to do this, Theren admitted. Be someone's partner. Be in a relationship that isn't about strategy or alliance or. Neither do I, Cassian said. So we'll figure it out together. Together, Theren repeated. The word felt good in his mouth. Solid. Cassian leaned in slowly, giving Theren time to pull away. But Theren didn't pull away. He met Cassian halfway. The kiss was gentle. Careful. Nothing like the passionate crashes in stories. Just two men testing something fragile and new between them. When they pulled apart, Cassian was smiling slightly. We should probably tell Kian. Tell me what? Kian's voice came from behind them. They both jumped. Kian stood a few feet away, bundled in a heavy coat, her expression curious. How long have you been standing there? Cassian asked. Long enough. Kian walked over and planted herself in front of them, hands on her hips. Are you getting married for real now? Not just because you have to. Theren and Cassian looked at each other. Yes, Theren said. if Duke Cassian agrees. I agree, Cassian said quietly. Kian's whole face lit up. Good. Because families should stay together. And you're my family now. She looked at Theren. Both of you. Something in Theren's chest cracked open. Kian, there's something I need to talk to you about. About your brother. Kian's smile faded slightly, but she nodded and climbed up onto the bench between them. Theren took a breath. Your brother was the bravest person I ever met. Not because he was a great fighter. He wasn't actually. He was average at best. Kian giggled despite herself. But he was brave in a way that mattered more, Theren continued. He told the truth even when it was dangerous. He stood up for what was right even when everyone else stayed quiet. And he loved you more than anything in this world. Kian's eyes were filling with tears, but she was listening intently. He talked about you constantly, Theren said. About how smart you were. How kind. How you always saw the good in people. He said. Theren's voice caught. He said you were his little star. That everything else was just what he did until he could get home to you. A tear rolled down Kian's cheek. And when he died, Theren said gently, he wasn't afraid. He was worried about me. About whether I'd be okay. And his last words were asking me to find you. To take care of you. Kian was crying now, but not the horrible broken crying from before. This was different. Sad but also something else. He chose to save me, Theren said. Because he believed I could do good. That I could help people. That I could be better than I was. He cupped Kian's face gently. And he was right. Because of him I found you. And because of you I found my way back to being human. He was a hero, Kian whispered. Yes, Theren said. He was. The best kind. Kian threw her arms around Theren's neck and held on tight. Cassian's hand came to rest on Kian's back, and then Theren's free arm wrapped around Cassian too, pulling him close. They sat there in the garden like that. Three people who'd been broken in different ways holding each other together. I miss him, Kian said into Theren's shoulder. I miss Dorian so much. I know, Theren said. I do too. But I'm glad I have you, Kian added. Both of you. You'll always have us, Cassian said quietly. That's a promise. Kian pulled back and looked between them seriously. Good. Because I've decided something. What's that? Theren asked. You're going to adopt me properly, Kian announced. With papers and everything. And Duke Cassian is going to marry you. And we're going to be a real family. Theren felt his throat tighten. If that's what you want. It's what I want, Kian said firmly. Dorian wanted me to be safe and loved and happy. And I am. Because of you. She looked at Cassian. Because of both of you. Cassian's eyes were suspiciously bright. Then that's what we'll do. Good, Kian said, settling back between them with satisfaction. Now someone needs to teach me properly how to shift because my wolf is still being very shy and I think she needs encouragement. Theren laughed. Actually laughed, warm and real. All right. We'll work on it together. All three of us, Kian said. Because that's what families do. All three of us, Theren agreed. They sat in the garden as the sun climbed higher. As the snow continued to melt. As winter gave way to spring. And Theren thought about Dorian. About the promise he'd made. About how sometimes the greatest gift someone could give you was believing you could be better than you were. He'd keep that promise. He'd take care of Kian. He'd build something good with Cassian. He'd be the person Dorian had believed he could be. Not for redemption. Not for forgiveness. Just because it was right. And maybe that was enough. Chapter 12. The council chamber was full. Not just with advisors and nobles but with people. Common folk who'd come to witness something they'd never thought they'd see. The Alpha King formally adopting a child. Making it official in front of everyone. Kian stood beside Theren at the front of the room, wearing a new tunic the color of deep blue. Someone had tried to tame his hair, but it was already escaping in wild curls. He looked nervous, small. His hand kept finding Theren's, squeezing tight. You don't have to be scared, Theren said quietly. I'm not scared, Kian said. I'm excited. But also what if I mess up? What if I say the wrong thing? There's no wrong thing, Cassian said from Theren's other side. You just have to say yes when they ask if you accept. I can do that, Kian said, nodding seriously. I'm very good at saying yes. Theren smiled despite his own nerves. He'd faced down armies without feeling this anxious. But this mattered in a way battles never had. This was choosing to be a father. Choosing to give Kian the family she deserved. The court official stepped forward, an old beta with kind eyes and an enormous book of law. He cleared his throat. "We are gathered today to witness the formal adoption of Kian Ashford into House Valdis," he announced. His voice carried across the chamber. "This is not merely a legal matter. It is a sacred bond. A promise made before witnesses that cannot be broken." The room went quiet. "Alpha King Theron Valdis," the official said. "Do you swear to protect this child? To provide for his needs, to guide him with wisdom, to love him as your own blood?" Theren looked down at Kian. At those mismatched eyes that had haunted him since Dorian's death. At the child who'd somehow seen good in him when no one else did. "I swear it," Theren said. His voice was steady. "With everything I am." The official nodded. "And do you promise to honor the memory of those who came before? To ensure that this child knows where he came from, even as he becomes part of your house?" "I promise," Theren said. Kian will always know about his brother. About Dorian's courage, his kindness, his love. That will never be forgotten. Kian's eyes were shining with tears, but he was smiling. "Kian Ashford," the official turned to him. "Do you accept Alpha King Theron Valdis as your father? Do you consent to join House Valdis and take on all the rights and responsibilities that come with it?" Kian took a breath. When he spoke, his voice was clear and certain. "Yes, I accept. I want him to be my father." The official smiled. "Then by the authority granted to me by the laws of this kingdom, I declare this adoption complete. From this day forward, you are Kian Valdis, son of Alpha King Theren, heir to House Valdis." The chamber erupted in applause. Not polite, obligatory applause. Real celebration. People were genuinely happy about this. Kian looked up at Theren with wonder. "I have a family name now." "You do," Theren said. His throat was tight. "Kian Valdis." Kian threw himself at Theren, arms wrapping around his waist. Theren caught him easily, lifting him up. Kian was getting bigger, heavier. Soon Theren wouldn't be able to lift him like this anymore. But for now, he held his son close and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for too long. Cassian stepped closer, his hand coming to rest on Theron's shoulder. When Theren looked at him, Cassian was smiling. Really smiling, warm and unguarded in a way Theren still wasn't used to. "Congratulations," Cassian said softly. "Father." The word did something to Theren. Made him feel grounded in a way he'd never felt before. Like he'd finally found the thing he was meant to protect. Not a kingdom. Not territory. This child, this man beside him, this fragile new family they were building from broken pieces. The celebration continued around them. Nobles approaching to offer congratulations. Servants bringing out wine and food. Someone started playing music in the corner. It felt more like a festival than a formal proceeding. Kian wiggled down eventually, and immediately started showing off his new name to anyone who would listen. "I'm Kian Valdis now. That's my father. Yes, the king. Yes, I know I'm very lucky." Theren watched him bounce from person to person, and felt pride swell in his chest. "He's going to be insufferable about this," Cassian observed. "Probably," Theren agreed. "I don't care." "No," Cassian said, smiling. "I don't think you do." They stood there together, watching their son make friends with half the court through sheer enthusiasm. And Theren thought about Dorian again. About whether his friend would be happy with how things turned out. Whether he'd approve of Theren raising his little brother. He thought Dorian would. Hoped he would. "You're thinking about him," Cassian said quietly. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to me." Cassian's hand found Theren's. "He'd be proud. Of both of you." "You think so?" "I know so," Cassian said. "You kept your promise. You found Kian. You protected him. You gave him a home. That's exactly what Dorian asked for." Theren squeezed Cassian's hand. "Thank you." "For what?" "For staying. For helping me figure out how to be this." Theren gestured vaguely at the room, at Kian, at everything. "I couldn't do it without you." "You could," Cassian said. "But I'm glad you don't have to." They were interrupted by Kian running back, dragging another child behind him. A young Omega with nervous eyes and too thin limbs. "Father," Kian said the word like he'd been waiting his whole life to say it. "This is Micah. He just arrived yesterday with the refugees. He doesn't have anyone and he's scared, and I told him you help people. So can he stay? Please? Theren looked at the frightened child, then at Kian's pleading face, then at Cassian who was clearly trying not to laugh. Of course he can stay, Theren said. Everyone who needs refuge has a place here. That includes you, Micah. The child's eyes went wide. Really? Really? Theren confirmed. Kian will show you around. Make sure you have everything you need. Kian beamed and immediately started chattering at Micah about all the best hiding spots in the palace and where the kitchen kept the good pastries and how if you asked nicely the guards would let you watch training sessions. You realize, Cassian said as the boys ran off, that Kian is going to bring home every stray child he finds now. I know, Theren said. And you're going to say yes every time. Probably. Cassian laughed. Who are you and what have you done with the ruthless conqueror I was betrothed to? I killed him, Theren said simply. Good riddance. Cassian's expression softened. Yes, he said quietly. Good riddance. The celebration wound down eventually. Nobles departed, servants cleaned up, the chamber slowly emptied. Kian had fallen asleep in a chair in the corner, exhausted from excitement. Micah was curled up next to him, already trusting enough to sleep near his new friend. Theren carried Kian back to his rooms. Cassian walked beside him and it felt natural. Easy. Like they'd been doing this together for years instead of weeks. They tucked Kian into bed. The boy didn't even wake, just made a soft sound and burrowed deeper into the blankets. He's happy, Cassian said, brushing hair back from Kian's forehead. He is, Theren agreed. Finally. They stood there for a moment watching him sleep. This child who'd changed everything. Who'd walked up to a king everyone feared and asked for help with complete faith that it would be given. Come on, Cassian said eventually. Let him rest. They walked back to Theron's chambers together. It had become habit over the past weeks. Cassian staying close, making sure Theren was healing properly. Making sure he wasn't alone. I should go, Cassian said when they reached Theron's door. But he didn't move. Or you could stay, Theren said. Cassian looked at him. Stay. Just to talk, Theren added quickly. Unless you'd rather. I'll stay, Cassian said. To talk. They went inside. Theron's chambers were different now. Less cold, less empty. There were books Cassian had left scattered around. A cloak thrown over a chair. Small signs that someone else existed in this space. They sat by the fire. Close together on the sofa, not quite touching but almost. Thank you, Theren said again. For today. For all of this. You keep thanking me, Cassian said. I'm not doing you a favor. I want to be here. Why? Theren asked. He needed to understand. After everything I did to your people, to your kingdom, why would you want to be here? Cassian was quiet for a long moment. Because I see who you're becoming, he said finally. And I want to be part of that. Part of building something better. Even though I destroyed what you had before? You can't give me back what I lost, Cassian said. No one can. But you can help me build something new. We can build it together. Theren reached out and took Cassian's hand. I want that. More than I've wanted anything. Then we'll do it, Cassian said. One day at a time. They sat there in the firelight, hands clasped, and let themselves imagine it. A future that wasn't about war or conquest or survival. Just a family growing and healing together. I love you, Theren said suddenly. The words fell out before he could stop them. I don't know when it happened, but I do. I love you. Cassian's breath caught. Theren. You don't have to say it back, Theren said quickly. I just needed you to know. You're an idiot, Cassian said, but he was smiling. Of course I love you too. Why else would I put up with all of this? Theren laughed and then Cassian was kissing him. Properly this time. Not gentle or careful but real. Full of promise and want and the beginning of something neither of them quite understood yet. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Cassian rested his forehead against Theron's. Stay, Theren whispered. Not just tonight. Stay. I'm not going anywhere, Cassian promised. You're stuck with me now. Good, Theren said. That's exactly what I want. They stayed there by the fire, wrapped up in each other, and let the world exist without them for a while. Tomorrow there would be kingdoms to run and policies to change and a child to raise. But tonight there was just this. Just them. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Epilogue, 2 years later. The spring festival was in full swing. The palace courtyard was packed with people, nobles and commoners mixed together in a way that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. Music drifted through the air, children ran between the tables shrieking with laughter, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread made everything feel warm and alive. Cassian stood on the balcony overlooking it all, a cup of wine in his hand, watching the chaos below with something that felt dangerously close to contentment. "You're hiding?" Theron's voice came from behind him. "I'm observing," Cassian corrected without turning around. "You're hiding," Theren repeated, stepping up beside him. "Kian has been looking for you. Kian has been recruiting me to judge the archery contest for the 5th time," Cassian said. "I'm taking a strategic break." Theren laughed. That sound still did things to Cassian's chest, even after 2 years. 2 years of marriage, of building something real together, and Cassian still wasn't used to how good it felt. Below them, Kian appeared in the crowd. Taller now, almost 10 years old, his voice starting to crack when he got excited. He was dragging 3 other children behind him, all of them refugees who'd found their way to the palace over the past years. The fortress had become something of a sanctuary. Word had spread. If you were displaced, if you were hurt, if you had nowhere else to go, the Alpha King would take you in. Theron's doing mostly, though Cassian had helped. They'd reformed the entire system together. Opened the borders, established aid stations, created programs for Omegas and orphan children. The kingdom looked completely different now. "He's happy," Theren said, watching Kian. There was still wonder in his voice when he said it. Like he couldn't quite believe they'd managed this. "He is," Cassian agreed. "You did that." "We did that," Theren corrected. "Don't pretend you weren't part of it." Cassian smiled. "Fine. We did that." Kian spotted them on the balcony and waved frantically. "Father. Papa Cassian. Come down. The contest is starting. Papa Cassian." Kian had started calling him that about 6 months ago, tentative at first, testing to see if it was allowed. Cassian had nearly cried the first time. Had pulled the boy into a hug and said yes, of course it was allowed, he'd be honored. "We should go down," Theren said. "Before he comes up here and drags us." "He would too," Cassian said. "When did he get so bossy?" "He learned from the best," Theren said, smirking. "Are you implying I'm bossy?" "I'm stating a fact." Cassian shoved him lightly and Theren caught his hand, pulling him close. Kissed him right there on the balcony where anyone could see. 2 years ago that would have caused a scandal. Now people barely blinked. The Alpha King and his consort, openly affectionate, clearly in love. It had become normal. "Come on," Theren said against Cassian's lips. "Our son is waiting." Our son. Those words still made Cassian's chest tight. They headed down together, hand in hand. The crowd parted for them automatically, but not out of fear anymore. Out of respect. Out of something that looked almost like affection. Kian rushed over immediately. "Finally. I thought you were going to miss it. Micah is competing and I told him you'd watch and he's so nervous and—" "Breathe," Cassian said, laughing. "We're here. We'll watch." Kian beamed and dragged them toward the archery range that had been set up. A dozen children were lined up, ranging from 8 to 15. Micah was among them, the same nervous Omega Kian had befriended 2 years ago. He'd grown confident since then. Found his place here. They all had. The contest began. Children took turns shooting at targets, some hitting, some missing wildly and laughing about it. It wasn't about perfection. It was about trying. About having a safe place to learn and grow and make mistakes. Theron's hand found Cassian's again, squeezed once. Cassian glanced at him. "What?" "Nothing," Theren said. "Just, thank you." "For what?" "For this. For staying. For helping me build something worth protecting." Cassian looked around. At the children laughing, at the people dancing, at the kingdom that had transformed from a war machine into something that actually cared about its people. "Thank you for letting me," Cassian said quietly. "For giving me a reason to stay." They stood there together, watching their son cheer for his friends, and Cassian thought about how far they'd all come. From enemies to allies to something deeper. From broken pieces to something whole. "Hey!" Kian appeared at Theron's elbow suddenly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Theren said, crouching to Kian's level. Even now, even after 2 years, he always made himself smaller for Kian. Always met him eye to eye. "I was thinking," Kian said carefully, "about Dorian. About how he saved you." Theron's expression shifted. They talked about Dorian regularly now. Shared stories kept his memory alive. But it still hurt sometimes. What about it? Theren asked gently. I think, Kian said slowly, that he'd be happy. About how everything turned out. About us being a family. Theron's eyes went bright. You think so? I know so, Kian said with certainty. Because he wanted me to be safe and loved. And I am. Because of you. He looked at Cassian. Because of both of you. Cassian felt his own throat tighten. And I think, Kian continued, that saving you was the best thing he ever did. Because look at all the people you've helped. All the kids who have homes now because of you. That's what Dorian wanted. For his sacrifice to mean something. Theren pulled Kian into a hug, holding him tight. It meant everything, he said roughly. He gave me you. He gave me a reason to be better. You were always good, Kian said into Theron's shoulder. You just needed someone to see it. They stayed like that for a moment. Then Kian pulled back, grinning. Okay, emotional moment over. Micah won the contest and we're having a celebration feast. Come on. He ran off again, energy apparently endless. Theren stood slowly, wiping his eyes. Cassian pretended not to notice, giving him privacy for the grief that still surfaced sometimes. He's right, you know, Cassian said quietly. Dorian would be proud. I hope so, Theren said. I try to honor what he gave me. Every day. You do, Cassian said firmly. You honor it by being the father Kian deserves. By being the king your people need. By choosing mercy over conquest. Theren looked at him. By choosing you. By choosing me, Cassian agreed, smiling. They followed Kian back into the crowd, into the noise and warmth and life of the festival. And Cassian thought about how sometimes the best things came from the worst circumstances. How sometimes you had to lose everything to find what actually mattered. He'd lost his kingdom. Lost his father. Lost the life he'd thought he'd live. But he'd gained this. This strange, beautiful family. This man who'd learned how to be gentle. This child who'd taught them both how to love. Papa Cassian. Kian called from across the courtyard. Father. Come try the honey cakes. They're amazing. Coming. Cassian called back. Theron's hand slipped into his as they walked. Easy. Natural. Like they'd been doing this forever. I love you, Theren said quietly. I love you too, Cassian replied. Now and always. They joined their son at the table, surrounded by laughter and music and the family they'd built from ashes and promises and one soldier's dying wish. And somewhere, Cassian liked to think Dorian Ashford was watching. Smiling. Knowing that his little brother was safe and loved and home. That his sacrifice had mattered. That everything had turned out exactly as it should. The end. Thank you for reading this story. If you enjoyed Kian, Theren, and Cassian's journey, let me know in the comments. These characters only exist because you listen, you engage, you care. And that means more than you know. Until the next story.